It was a dreary evening, the kind that pressed heavy upon your chest, as if the world itself had sighed in frustration and was holding its breath. The mansion, old and weary, loomed in the distance, its weathered stone walls telling tales of forgotten grandeur. Inside, the air was thick, stifled by the weight of the darkness outside. I, Alexander Kane, sat alone in my study, the flickering light from the single candle casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. A breeze whispered through the cracks in the window, but it did little to bring any comfort. It was as if even the world had turned its back on me. I had always been the type to internalize my thoughts, a quiet observer, the sort of person who never sought the spotlight but had a mind sharp enough to cut through the thickest of problems. For 20 years, I had been loyal, not just to the company, but to him, my boss, my mentor, Solomon Kings, a man whose name was synonymous with power, wealth, and success. A man who had promised me everything, the world in fact, and I had given him everything in return. I had bled for his vision, worked tirelessly through the endless nights, built his empire with the precision of a master craftsman. I had trusted him, believed in him. But as I sat in that room, with the flickering shadows dancing on the walls, I understood that trust, like a fragile thread, had snapped under the weight of his betrayal. It wasn't just a business decision. It wasn't about a position I had been passed over for, or a project that had been handed to someone else. No, it was far worse. The betrayal was personal, deeply personal. It had been a quiet, calculated act, something that had been brewing for months, if not years. He had fired me. After all I had given him, after all the sacrifices I had made, he had simply let me go without a second thought, without a single word of thanks or recognition. The phone call came one afternoon, cold and detached, just like him. "It's time to move on," his voice echoed in my ear. No explanation, no remorse, just a simple, heartless directive. But what stung most wasn't the dismissal. It was the way he had treated me after everything we had been through, the years of loyalty, the shared struggles, the countless hours we had spent building something together. Now, I was nothing more than a discarded piece of paper, crumpled up and thrown away, without a second glance. I felt my pulse quicken as the realization sank in. I had been a fool, blinded by my own dedication, my own need to please. The anger welled up inside me like a burning tide, threatening to swallow me whole. My hands trembled with the rawness of the emotions that had been stirred up. Sadness, yes. But more than that, anger. I had been wronged. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the sting of it, deep and raw. I stood up, walking slowly to the window, the darkness outside mirroring the emptiness that had consumed me. The city lights flickered in the distance, but I felt no connection to them. I had lost my place in that world, my position in the order of things. The betrayal had cut deeper than anything else. It wasn't just a loss of status or wealth. It was a loss of self, a loss of purpose. And that, I realized, was when the idea began to form, like a dark seed in the pit of my stomach. The desire for revenge. It was subtle at first, a mere thought passing through my mind like a shadow. But as I stood there, staring into the blackness, the idea grew, fed by the injustice, fueled by my fury. I would make him regret this. Every single moment of it. But first, I needed to be sure. I needed to plan. Carefully, methodically. I could not afford to fail. This was no longer about getting back what I had lost. It was about showing him the cost of betrayal. I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. There was no turning back now. The game had begun. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sort of madness, a constant hum in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape the image of Solomon's face, the coldness of his words. I couldn't shake the weight of his betrayal. The anger simmered beneath my skin, a seething heat that threatened to erupt at the slightest provocation. I couldn't rest. Sleep eluded me, and when it came, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of retribution. Each night, I lay awake in my bed, the darkness pressing down on me like a suffocating force, as the plan slowly took shape in my mind. Each detail, each movement, carefully thought out, calculated. I had to be patient. I had to remain calm. Revenge, I knew, was not something to be rushed. It needed to be precise. And Solomon, that fool, would never see it coming. I began to stalk him, in a sense. Not in the traditional way, but by observing his every move, learning his habits, his routines. Solomon was predictable, arrogant. He trusted too easily, and I intended to use that to my advantage. I knew where he would be, at what time, and whom he would be with. I began to work behind the scenes, positioning myself just out of his sight, a shadow in the periphery. I needed him to let his guard down, to become complacent. It was then that I would strike, when he least expected it. The more I watched him, the more his arrogance became evident. He believed, in the deepest part of his soul, that he had won, that I would simply disappear into the shadows, forgotten. He couldn't have been more wrong. The nights were long, filled with a mix of obsessive thoughts and fleeting doubts. I questioned my resolve. Was I really prepared to do this? Was the satisfaction of seeing him suffer worth the toll it would take on me? The moral hesitation gnawed at my conscience, but the anger drowned it out. Forgiveness felt impossible. There was no way back now. I had been wronged, and I would not let him go unpunished. The world had its rules, and Solomon had broken them. Now, it was my turn to rewrite the narrative. Each day I spent in this mental warfare only deepened my obsession. I could no longer focus on anything else. Work, personal life, even simple pleasures, it all became irrelevant. All that mattered was him, and the moment when I would finally make him realize the depth of his mistake. It was then that I started to manipulate the smallest of things. A well-placed word here, a strategically timed message there. Slowly, I began to influence his decisions, to plant the seeds of his own downfall. My movements were subtle, like a chess player moving pieces in the dark. I would break him piece by piece. But as the days wore on, the isolation became harder to bear. I had no one to talk to, no one who could understand what I was going through. I was becoming someone else, someone I didn't recognize. The person I had been, the calm, rational man, was slipping away, replaced by someone darker, someone consumed by bitterness. Yet the darkness felt powerful. It gave me focus, strength. And so I continued. One step, then another, my resolve hardening with each passing day. Solomon had no idea what was coming. The end game was drawing near, and I would not let it slip through my fingers. The night arrived, dark and still, as though the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of the moment. I stood on the precipice of what I had planned for so long, every detail falling into place. I felt the weight of my decision in every bone, every heartbeat. The moment I had been carefully orchestrating was within reach. Solomon had grown careless. The power he had once wielded with such calculated precision was now slipping through his fingers, and he didn't even know it. He was walking directly into the trap, blind to the danger I had set for him. I watched him from the shadows, the flickering light of the street lamp casting long, unsettling shadows on the pavement as he made his way to the event I had orchestrated for him. The plan had been simple. Make him believe everything was normal. Let him believe that he had won. I had strategically placed the right people around him, the right circumstances, making sure that his ego would remain undisturbed, unchallenged. He would not know he was walking toward his own undoing until it was too late. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. After everything, after years of loyalty, the moment when Solomon would finally face the consequences of his betrayal would be a moment of complete and utter humiliation. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait. I watched him laugh and shake hands with the same people who had once been my colleagues, all of them oblivious to the game I had been playing. They had no idea that the man standing before them, shaking hands and accepting praise, was already trapped in his own hubris. The air buzzed with a strange energy, a sickening sense of inevitability. The moment came like a flood, sudden and overwhelming. Solomon made his way to the podium, his face confident, his voice strong. I had done my work well. He was convinced that everything was in his control. The room was silent, expectant, as he raised the microphone to his lips. And then it happened. A single word, a slip of the tongue, a brief moment of carelessness. His own words betrayed him, revealing the truth that he had hidden from the world for so long. The secret I had planted, the one that would destroy his credibility, his reputation, it came out like a whisper, too soft at first, but then louder, louder still, until it was undeniable. The faces in the room shifted from admiration to confusion, then to shock. The looks of disbelief spread like wildfire, the whispers growing in intensity. Solomon's composure faltered. For the first time, I saw it, the crack in his facade. He stammered, trying to regain control, but the damage had been done. The betrayal he had once inflicted on me was now being returned tenfold. I stood in the back of the room, watching as the room turned against him. There was a brief surge of triumph in my chest, a rush of adrenaline that sent my pulse racing. I had won. He was finally getting what he deserved. But then something shifted. As the chaos unfolded around him, I felt the briefest pang of unease, a whisper of doubt that seemed to cut through the storm of victory. The look on Solomon's face, utter disbelief, fear, and a deep, sinking humiliation, began to remind me of myself, of how I had felt, standing there in my study, betrayed, broken. Had I become him? The question gnawed at me, its weight sinking deep into my chest. I had spent so long consumed by the need for revenge that I hadn't stopped to consider the cost. Had I crossed the line? Was this truly justice? Or had I simply become the thing I hated most? The room continued to buzz, but all I could hear was the echo of my own thoughts. The victory felt hollow, bitter in my mouth. Solomon's breakdown was slow, agonizing. The man who had once commanded a room now stood silent, his face pale, his hands shaking. He had been broken, not by the world, but by his own pride. The fall from power was not just physical. It was spiritual, psychological. It was as if his very soul had been stripped bare. But as I stood there, watching the consequences of my actions unfold, I realized that I was not the only one being punished. The trap I had set for him had ensnared me as well. The guilt, the self-loathing, it was a weight that threatened to crush me. Was this truly what I had wanted? The question haunted me as the night wore on, the atmosphere heavy with the remnants of the destruction I had wrought. It was done. The game had ended. But as I walked away from the scene, I felt no satisfaction, no peace, only the cold, oppressive silence. The days that followed were suffocating, as though the very air had thickened with regret. I wandered through them in a haze, my mind spinning in circles, caught between the cold emptiness of victory and the gnawing weight of my actions. The world outside moved on, indifferent, but inside me there was nothing but a hollow quiet. I had seen the shock in Solomon's eyes, the disbelief, the devastation, and yet it did nothing to soothe the ache in my chest. It had been everything I'd imagined, yet nothing at all. I had been so sure that this would bring me peace, that seeing him undone would somehow fill the void he had left in me. But peace was an illusion, as fleeting as the fleeting satisfaction I had felt in the midst of his fall. In the silence of my home, the guilt was relentless, a constant hum beneath my skin. The world outside seemed distant, unreal. I had taken what I had thought was mine, but the truth was I had destroyed something far more important, myself. I paced the darkened rooms of my mansion, each step heavy, each breath slow and measured. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now seemed oppressive. I could no longer find solace in the space I had built for myself. The house felt like a tomb, and I, the one who had laid the stones for my own entrapment. What had I become? The question haunted me. The man I had been, the man who had worked so tirelessly, so loyally, had vanished. In his place stood a man who had allowed the fire of vengeance to consume him whole. Solomon was no longer the only one broken. I, too, had fractured under the weight of my own rage. I could not escape the thought that I had become the very thing I despised. The bitterness, the coldness, the heartless cruelty. It all ran through my veins now, inescapable, irrevocable. I had sought justice, but what I had found instead was a deeper torment. The darkness I had sought to impose on Solomon had taken root inside me. And yet, as I sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me, there was something else, a bitter clarity that emerged. The idea of vengeance had seemed so sweet in the beginning, but it was a poison, slow and insidious. Revenge had not brought me back what I had lost. It had not restored my honor, nor my dignity. It had stripped me bare, exposed my weaknesses, and left me with nothing but the hollow shell of a man who had once been whole. Was it worth it? I asked myself over and over, but there was no answer. The question seemed meaningless, as if the act itself had erased the need for answers. All that was left was the deep, unyielding ache in my chest, the realization that no victory, no matter how sweet, could heal the wounds I had inflicted on myself. I had made him pay, yes. But at what cost? What had I truly gained? Solomon had fallen, his empire crumbled, his reputation shattered. But I had lost myself. The man who had once been Alexander Kane, sharp and composed, was gone. In his place was a ghost, adrift in a world that felt both too small and too vast. I stood up and moved toward the window, staring out into the night, the world spread out before me. It was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind. But it wasn't the peace I had imagined. It was the calm before the storm of my own conscience. I had become what I feared, and I realized too late that vengeance had not only destroyed Solomon, it had destroyed me. The world would forget. Time would move on, but I would remain trapped in my own mind, unable to outrun the ghosts of my actions. The cost of revenge had been far greater than I had ever imagined. And as the final embers of my vengeance cooled to ash, I understood the cruel irony. Solomon had lost everything, but so had I. In the end, there were no winners, only the wreckage left in the wake of what we had both lost.